Great. Hi, everyone. As Josh said, yeah, my name is Connor. Um, I guess a bit help some information. I was a London University student, well, 7 years ago. I was a medical student, but since then I kind of left medicine to start working for a Christian charity called UCCF, which helps students think about, well, questions like the question we're tackling today. Can anyone be forgiven? And I wonder if forgive me, this is going to be a little bit morbid, but I wanted to start by thinking about this question. I'd like to imagine, sorry for doing this, but you have just died out of nowhere, and it wasn't due to coronavirus. You've slipped on a banana skin and you've died. And you are kind of standing before God, whatever kind of concept of God that you have at the moment, and God turns to you and says, why do you deserve forgiveness? Why do you deserve forgiveness? I wonder what you might say to that question. What you say to that question probably has something to do with the culture that you kind of grew up in. So if you come from kind of an Islamic culture, you might say something like this: well, I deserve to be forgiven because, well, I'm relatively good. I believe in Allah. I've I've been on pilgrimage to Mecca. I've given to the poor. I've done zakat. I've fasted at Ramadan, and I haven't done anything too bad. So I haven't murdered anyone. I am relatively good. If you come from maybe a different culture, maybe you come from kind of a Hindu culture, you might say a similar-ish thing. I'm I'm relatively good. I mean, I go to temple, I meditate, I've washed, I'm clean, and I haven't done any of kind of those crazy things. Maybe that's what you'd say. And I wonder, most of us are probably from some kind of Western culture, maybe, or at least in UCL. So have a culture at UCL. And I wonder if the kind of normal, kind of agnostic student that you would just stop might say something similar-ish. They might be surprised there is God, okay, and say, well, I think I might deserve forgiveness because I'm relatively good. Okay, I do my best to kind of spread positivity, not negativity. I I definitely am not as bad as some people. Like, I'm not a neo-Nazi. I'm not a white supremacist. I'm not one of them. I'm relatively good. And I wonder if you were to think what a Christian might say at this point, I reckon most people would think a Christian would say a similar-ish thing. I'm relatively good. But today, if you think that, I think you might be surprised by what Jesus actually says. Because Jesus tackles this question head on. We're gonna look at just one story Jesus says from Luke's gospel, which is a kind of historical account of Jesus' life made up of eyewitnesses. And he tells this story, answering this question: can anyone be forgiven? And he does it in a very interesting way. In the story, we're gonna see kind of two main characters. One is called a Pharisee, and they are the kind of quintessentially relatively good person in Jewish culture. I mean, they do a pretty good job of following the Jewish laws. They're kind of known to be fairly generous, give money to charity, that kind of thing. So we have a quintessentially good person, and then we have the other main character, which is a quintessentially bad person in kind of Jewish kind of first century culture. We have a character who's only known as the tax collector. Now, I imagine kind of probably none of you guys are paying tax at the moment, but even nowadays, people don't like the tax man. But back in first century Israel, no, people really didn't like the tax man. See, Rome occupied Israel. And what the Romans did to tax the Jewish people, they got Jews to take positions as tax collectors, but they didn't like pay them a salary, like the same way we kind of have a concept of a salary. What they said, you decide how much you'll tax your people, and we'll take the requirement to Rome. So what most tax collectors did, they kind of hiked the taxes for their own people, skimmed off the top, and then gave some to Rome. Which meant if you were a Jewish person and you saw a wealthy tax collector, you would know all their wealth is stolen from your brothers and sisters. They are the quintessential bad guy of kind of Judaism at the time. So that's kind of the intro to this story. We're going to see a good guy and a bad guy, a relatively good guy and a relatively bad guy. And Jesus says this story. I'm going to try and get it up. Here we go. So feel free to read along. To some, this is Jesus talking, to some who are confident of their own righteousness and look down on everyone else, Jesus told this parable, this story. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood by himself and prayed, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. So this Pharisee is standing before God, and what is he saying? Well, I'm relatively good. I'm not like all those kind of other people. And I kind of do the good things, the religiously good things. I fast and I give my money. I'm relatively good. But then we get the tax collector. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. See, the tax collector says something very different. He knows he's not relatively good. He says, I'm a sinner in need of mercy. And here is the big surprise. Jesus says, I tell you, this man, the tax collector, the bad guy, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For all those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. You see what Jesus is doing here? He's doing something very simple, but very interesting. And he tackles the question that we have today head on. Can anyone be forgiven? Well, yes. Robbers, evildoers, adulterers, even tax collectors can be forgiven when they realize they are sinners who need God's mercy. So can anyone be forgiven? Yes. But here's the thing, not everyone will be forgiven. See, it is crazy, and this is offensive. It's offensive then, and it's still offensive now. Jesus says, if you rely on being relatively good or better than others, then you will not be forgiven. Anyone can be forgiven. Any person, no matter how bad they are, can be forgiven. But you have to give up on trying to earn your own forgiveness. And I know this sounds crazy. It is so different to what we might presume Christianity says. It's so different to what so many cultures and religions say. But I think if we take a couple of moments to understand this, we might see it is very, very good news. See, this is the Pharisees' way of thinking. Imagine there is a line of people, and there's bad people and there's good people, and there's a line somewhere down the middle. And if you are on this side, you are relatively good and you've earned forgiveness. And if you're on this side, you're relatively bad and deserve punishment. That's how the Pharisees thought. That's kind of how lots of us think, naturally. But there's some problems with that, right? If there is a line somewhere, well, then who decides where the line is? In fact, it's quite a scary thought, isn't it? How close am I to that line? Do I know if I am someone who has earned forgiveness? That's terrifying. And then even if you're on this camp, right? Even if you think, oh yes, I'm so relatively good, I'm safely past the line. Well, what does that do to you? Well, it makes you almost insufferably arrogant. I mean, that's what happens to the Pharisee. Did you hear the kind of unattractiveness of what he was saying? God, thank you that I am not like those people, the evildoers, adulterers. It's deeply unattractive. But isn't that what our culture is doing right now? I mean, it doesn't take long being on Twitter to see this happen in action, with cancel culture going crazy. We're not like those people over there. And then if you know you're on the other side of the line, if you know you're relatively bad, well, you are hopeless. This Pharisaical, well, to be honest, normal way of thinking about who gets forgiven is horrible. And to be honest, it doesn't seem true to be able to separate people into relatively good and relatively bad. It just doesn't make sense. There is a famous quote by this guy. I'm going to call him Alexander S. because I butcher his surname and I don't want to do that. He lived through kind of the Russian Gulag camps. He lived through the time of Joseph Stalin, and he got sent to the camps after he wrote a private letter to someone criticizing Joseph Stalin. But he says this. He says the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties, but right through every human heart. There isn't a group of goodies and a group of baddies. No, the problem is right here for all of us. I want to compare this kind of Pharisee idea of forgiveness, way of viewing the world, to the tax collector's view. See, the tax collector knew he was a sinner. He knew he was in trouble, and he freely admitted it. He said, I'm a messed up sinner who is in need of mercy. Now, our instinct might think, oh, that would be terrible to think of myself. But hold on a second. I think it might actually be freeing. Because here's the thing. I might be able to put on a really good show. But I know the real me. I know the things that I think, the selfish things that I do. Even forget God's laws for a second and the standard that they must be. I don't even live up to my own standards. I mean, I can't go a week or a day without doing, saying, or thinking something I'm ashamed of. See, I might be able to fool the world, but I cannot fool myself. And this way of understanding God and forgiveness, well, it means that I don't have to pretend anymore. I heard this quote quite a while ago, and it has really stuck with me. This is from Heidi Grant, a kind of social psychologist. She says this: you must be perfectly awesome in order to keep believing that you are. So you live in quiet terror of making mistakes and feel devastated when you do. Your only defense is to refocus your attention on all the things that you do well, mentally stroking your own ego until it has forgotten that horrible episode of unawesomeness and moved on to something more satisfying. When you think about it, it doesn't sound like a recipe for success, does it? See, if we have to pretend that we've got it all together, that we aren't really as bad as we are, it is miserable. We live in this quiet terror. And if our only defense is just to refocus on something that we do well, just like the Pharisee, it is awful. But the tax collector does something completely different. He knows he's a sinner. He knows he's not perfectly awesome. And his only defense is not himself. No, his only defense is God's mercy. See, I think this is good news. So, what is the Christian response to God saying, do you deserve forgiveness? It is absolutely not. I do not deserve forgiveness. I'm in desperate need of mercy. But God of the Bible, Jesus, you have shown me that you are a merciful God. Jesus not only says that he is, but also ultimately shows that he is when he dies on a cross for my sins. See, I do not deserve forgiveness. I am not relatively good. But Jesus shows me that he's a God who is merciful. So, can anyone be forgiven? The God of the Bible says, absolutely yes. If you can admit who you really are, a sinner who needs mercy. So I guess my question to you guys to think through is, are you a Pharisee or are you a tax collector? Will you go on thinking, no, I'm relatively good? Or will you cry out for mercy? I think this is really good news. I hope you will too. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand back to Josh and then very happy to take questions.
Thank you, Connor. Yeah, so if you don't have, or if you have any questions, please go over to Slido, which I think the link was in the chat, but maybe it'll be there again in a second. So just type in slido.com or sli.do, I think. Yeah, and then there should be a box. You can type in UCLCU, and it should take you to our little Slido page where you can ask some questions. If you don't have any questions, still head over there. You can vote the ones you like. And just give a couple of seconds for them to come in. So there's a couple there now. So, Connor, why can't God allow people in heaven even if they have just like a little bit of evil?
Yeah, great. I'll give a silly answer and then I'll try and give I'll give a proper answer. I think it's a bit like saying, why don't you eat applesauce with just a little bit of poo in it? Like, of course you wouldn't. As in, that's a silly example, but it's making this point. A little bit of evil would ruin it. Yeah, I guess that is a kind of simple way of answering it. But I guess from a desire point of view, that is not what we would want. So we what we desperately want is evil to be got rid of, for death to be got rid of, to all of it be gone. I guess the problem is that there's evil in us. So to say that we want that gone is ultimately to say that we want us gone. And I think what we really want is heaven to be a place that is perfect. But to do that, God needs to work in us, and we need to admit that we need help. Thanks for the question, though.
So another one we have that's got a couple of votes is, can I just do whatever I want then, and as long as I come back and ask for forgiveness, be forgiven?
Yeah, this is obviously a really, really common question. Like, because it's kind of the kind of theoretical kind of thing that smashes the Christian worldview. Well, like, you guys can just go and do what you want because you believe you'll always be forgiven. Yes, I mean, that is theoretically true, but it's not. I know that sounds like a silly answer, but trust me, it's not. If you are someone who understands what God has done for you by forgiving you, you change. Your whole idea of the way that you look at the world changes. You move from someone who loves kind of sinfulness to someone that hates it. And yes, it means you might still do things wrong, but your fundamental heart changes. So yes, it is theoretically possible, but in practice, it is just totally not what happens. Christians are people who know they've been forgiven and love God because of it, so their lives change. And if you had that attitude, you definitely have just not understood what's happened to you. So yes, I mean, theoretically possible, but it doesn't happen. Look at your Christian friends, and ask them how their life has changed, and you'll see very quickly that their life has.
And so you said, Jesus / God has kind of standards. How do we know that God's standards for judging people's hearts are fair?
Yeah, good question. I think yes, as in, the only way we can know that it's fair if God really is the kind of God he claims to be. So the God of the Bible claims to be completely good, kind of all-knowing. So he's kind of the only person who can judge rightly. Because as we all know, like the whole point of trials is that you're trying to uncover information to find out whether this person actually did right or wrong. Because we're humans, we only have access to so much information. The claim of the Bible is that God has all the information he could ever need, and that he judges rightly. So that's the claim. He is the only one that can judge rightly. And if that is true, that is a really good thing, because it means that no one gets away with anything. Yeah. So what I mean by that is, I want this to be true. I do not want, if there is a heaven and hell, for the person to be like a human who's got the gavel deciding who goes where. Yeah.
And then, how does Jesus's death relate to Christians being forgiven? Because you kind of talked about those as being related.
Yeah, I kind of slipped it in at the end there, kind of hoping someone might ask the question. So obviously this is the talk today. I wanted to say that this is what Jesus says. He says that sinners can receive mercy. He goes on to show that sinners can receive mercy. And I guess the best way of thinking about that is Jesus dying on the cross is the kind of visual representation that forgiveness has happened, that punishment has been taken, and so Jesus is taking the punishment on our behalf. So at the cross is the kind of public declaration that this is what actually Jesus was about, and he's done it. So the Christian idea of the cross is that Jesus takes the punishment that we deserve, and we get his righteousness. There's like a swap. So the cross is the way that what Jesus says in this passage can actually happen. He says in this passage, sinners can receive mercy, and he doesn't feel compelled to explain exactly the mechanism of that, partly because he goes on to die on the cross, and that is the mechanism of that. Yeah.
Great. So I think that's all of the questions we have. Yeah, that's all the questions we have, I think.